OCG players are, regardless of region, typically saying that Dragon Tail will be one of the strongest decks next format. Even on release, by the time I got to locals, people were already saying that Dragon Tail was the strongest of the new decks. So let's talk about why. I'll start by giving an overview of the deck, then discussing strengths and weaknesses. I won't be discussing different builds in this video, there are just too many. The most popular one is a King of the Swamp build with Polymerization and Red Eyes Dark Dragoon, and that's the one I'll mostly be referring to. But there are also Regenesis, Shaddoll, Magistus, or Fight for Package builds. I'm personally playing a pure version with the K9 hand trap package, so just know that they exist, but I won't be going over them in this video. If I were to use words to describe what Dragon Tail does, it would sound bad because it is a very unique deck. The engine is large, there's quite a decent number of bricks, and the plays also require a large number of cards. There is a choke point for hand traps, and it has a lot of qualities that recent good decks don't have. In recent formats, all of the best decks have taken one card and produced a lot from that one card. Dragon Tail doesn't do that. Dragon Tail uses a lot of cards to make things, but it does so in very few actions. That is, in my opinion, one of the greatest strengths of Dragon Tail. The deck is deceptively explosive. Explosive might not be the right word, but there have been decks in the past that accomplished their board in very few summons. Think Voiceless, for example. Barrier, Search Saphira, Dump and Add, Banish, Summon Skull Guardian Effect the Search, but Dragon Tail is really the first deck, I'd say, where you can make a reasonable board quite literally from doing one thing. I'm not saying the deck only does one thing on their turn, by the way. Most of the time it's three things if you're not counting resolving triggers. It's usually like one search and two fusions, sometimes more, sometimes less, depending on hand traps and interrupts. So why does that matter? Well, there are two main factors, I'd say. The first one is how interactable the main action is, and the second is the deck's ability to compromise. Regarding the first point about how interactable the main action is, this again comes in two parts. The first is whether you can stop the board setup from the action, and the second is whether or not you can actually stop the action. Stopping the board setup is easy to answer. You can't really. The effects trigger in the graveyard and place the cards on field, not add, which means you can't ash them. The only real way to stop them are if you play the 1-1 Gamma Driver ratio, or if you play the K9 package and Rip Renegade them. Stopping the actual fusion is a lot more difficult to answer. In short, you can stop most of the ways to fuse with Ash or Imperm, but you can't stop all of them, and they only need to resolve one of them to make a board. There are 3 ways to fuse going first, 4 ways to fuse going second, unless they're on a King of the Swamp build with Polymerization, in which case there is one additional way to fuse. 3 of these ways are interactable, both the spell cards are ashable, and the Cartesia is stoppable with effect negation. But Phimeta is not, except by Dominus Impulse, which can only be played by Malice or Orcust because it is basically just Polymerization. And they have a lot of Rotas, so it's hard to stop them from even getting to this card, even if they don't hard draw it, unless you drew both Ash and Imperm. And most importantly, they only need to successfully fuse one time to make their board. Let's take another fusion deck, such as Memento for example. That deck wants to make 2 fusions every time, and they only have 2 fusion cards, which means that negating one stops access to one of their 2 fusions. This deck really only needs to fusion one time to make competent interrupts, and they have 4 to 5 cards that can fuse, which means they have a degree of redundancy that makes it hard to completely stop. The second reason that the explosiveness matters is compromise. If you're going to be getting a lot from accomplishing one thing, that means that blowout hand traps, except for Shifter and Retaliating Sea, are going to do a lot less to your deck because you can just stop after the first action and have something pretty good. Retaliating Sea is looking like the side deck card of the format based on its impact against the new decks, so that is going to be a problem that will come up, but everything else is easy to play into. Maxi and Foolos have just become Upstart Goblin. The deck rarely special summons outside of the extra deck, so Molcharmies are -1 except for Foolos. Droll isn't going to do much, and Nib won't even be activatable. So individually, most of the cards don't read insane at all. It's mostly just a series of fine cards that forms a unique deck identity. There are really only 2 individual cards that feel very strong to me. The first one is Phimeta. It's a quick effect polymerization that you can use during the main phase, which means that it gives you turn 0 plays by letting you fuse for bounces on their turn, while also setting up follow-up. If you use the bricks to fuse, you also get effect negation or pops as well. To me, if I just read the card, I think a searchable quick effect polymerization alone would be playable. Actually, I know it's playable because both Chimera Fusion and Memento Fusion are playable, but this card also doubles as fusion material, which means its flexibility reduces the brick hands of the deck a lot. The other card that I would say individually reads pretty insane is the Fusion, Arizarion. It bounces monsters on the field or graveyard back to hand based on number of materials used from the hand, and this does a couple of things. First is that it disrupts your opponent's graveyard. Obviously, it's not always good to return things in your opponent's graveyard to their hand. This would do nothing to the Canine Wolf, for example, but it does sometimes disrupt them. It also recycles your fusion materials, which is very useful most of the time because if you use 5 mana to fuse, you haven't used her material effect to place yet. And it also lets you guarantee victory in games because if you hand trap them, then you can return the hand trap and basically lock them into infinite Tsukiyomi. It doesn't even have to be recycling Maxi. If they couldn't pass the first Ash, then they definitely won't pass the second one behind the board. It's also obviously a board breaker that is easily chain blockable. So to summarize, the deck has many strengths. The first is that the deck consistently makes something in a lot of games. It's really hard to stop them from making any interrupts, and the deck also has follow-up. The second is that it's a deck that has extremely strong compromises under most blowout hand traps, except for Shifter and Retaliating Sea. The third is that it has an engine that can function going second. Personally, I've been having a hard time winning going second, but I'm fairly certain that's due to pilot error because the deck itself has the qualities of a deck that can function going second, since it has removal, both targeting and non-targeting, as well as negates with chain blocking capabilities. The fourth is that it can play on its opponent's turn if they open 5 mana, and the bounces are a very strong interrupt. Older decks are just not designed to be able to handle getting multiple monsters bounced back to the extra deck, or into their hand. But it's also not a deck without clear weaknesses either. The first is that it is not a one-card starter deck. That doesn't really matter too much in the context of raw brick percentage in my opinion, because if I'm being honest, the deck is fairly consistent, especially because the second card you need is so generic. But it does matter in the context of needing a lot more cards to duo play. So it sometimes becomes awkward if you have to use your cards such as hand traps to disrupt them, or if they push through your initial setup. The second is that the deck itself is also not immune to hand traps the way a deck like Yummy is. Hand traps, even if used in a suboptimal spot, do something against the deck. An easy way to explain this is by going over an average Dragon Tail turn. The issue is that unless their hand is extremely strong, they're going to have to make a bounce fusion first. This is because the Dragon Tail player has cards that float, but no matter what, in order to do plays, you're going to have monsters in hand. So the monsters float, but they float into extenders or disruptions. That's why you can't afford to just fuse away your monsters and not recover them, which is why you almost always make this fusion first. There are not many hands that can start with a different fusion. Unfortunately, this also means that your most important choke point is first, and that also means it's very difficult to bait interrupts with a different card, and also quite uncomfortable to get hand trapped here. Sometimes you don't get hit here, you get hit on your normal summon, which you commit before this, whether that be the Stratos or the Cartesia, but this is not a good play for your opponent most of the time. Both can be good to interact with, but they have their own problems. Stopping Rukias can stop the 5 mana ad, but they have 6 Rotas, so it's 9 copies of 5 mana, which means a lot of the time, it's not good to stop the search unless you can also stop the bounces. Sometimes the opponent's logic is also praying that the Dragon Tail player doesn't have a second Dragon Tail monster, so they won't float on the second material. But the engine is so large, that's rarely the case. Still, unlike Yummy, if you deny this first search, even if they have a way to fuse in their hand, they're going to get denied a Dragon Tail material eventually unless their hand is all engine. Stopping Mururu also has problems, but it also has advantages as well. It leaves them with a fusion for your turn, but it stops a placement of both traps, so it doesn't do nothing even though you do leave them with a quick effect fusion on your turn. The main reasons players are hand trapping the normal is because their hand is not strong enough to beat the 2 traps. If they can't beat the 2 traps, then they're going to need to hand trap the starter and hope the Dragon Tail player bricks. The other solution is if they open multiple hand traps. If they have 2 imperms, then you can imperm the normal and the fusion, or if you have an imperm and an Ash Blossom, then it's decently safe to Ash as well. The deck doesn't really push through both an imperm and an Ash Blossom that often. The third weakness of the deck is that their follow-up is left on field, not in their hand. Recently, Konami has started adding a bunch of these place effects instead of search, which interacts better with Droll and Ash Blossom. However, placing is not objectively better than searching. It loses to removal, for example, which means that if your opponent manages to push past your board, they can start popping your follow-up. Of course, the traps are going to be useful. You can bounce yourself with a trap and draw 1, but it's not as safe as other decks follow-up, especially because this deck needs additional cards in hand to even start making plays. And then finally, this last one doesn't seem like it matters, but it comes up a lot more than it might seem. If for whatever reason you lose both traps, then you basically have no board on the next turn, and it's not that hard to lose both of them because both are interruptible by Ash or Bell. So if they have any non-targeting destruction, or if they stop the second trap somehow, then you're kind of cooked for the next turn, unless you find a way to kill them, or they have nothing left either. I think in terms of actual game design, Konami has been moving in positive directions since Crossover Breaker. More decks are playable on their opponent's turn with Engine. We're moving away from lingering floodgates, except for Molcharmies, which I personally think are net positive for the game. There's less Shifter, there's less Roll, there's less Maxi, there's less decks with one-card combos, and we're moving more towards multiple card combos, which requires a larger engine. Decks are capable of consistently making boards through hand traps without invalidating them. They're having a bigger focus on placing effects that are interactable with removal. That's just my opinion. Maybe you think these choices are bad, but I personally like them. And at the very least, I think it's very interesting that there's a clear shift in card design philosophy. Just to end off, I'm trying to word this very innocuously, but I'm not saying Dragon Tail is better than Yummy, or Yummy is better than Dragon Tail, or any deck is better than a new deck. I know these topics are quite sensitive for some people. I try to be very conservative with these things right when a new format starts, especially because the truth of the matter is, I don't know, and I don't think the answer to that question matters that much. I think too often people talk about which decks are better than other decks, and in my opinion, it's a lot more useful to talk about what each deck does specifically and what situations it struggles in or performs well in. Now, I'm not saying that if someone says X deck is better than another, that means that I think they're saying useless things. Most of the time when someone says that, they've already spent time to figure out when a deck is good and what its strengths and weaknesses and matchups are. And they've just compartmentalized all those things into a statement of X deck is better than another deck. So the original opinion ends up being pretty useful for starting discussions, but a lot of times people don't extrapolate beyond that initial comment, and that's when I think things start getting unproductive. When I say something is good, that just means I think it's worth testing and experimenting with, and I think all the new decks at the moment are good in the sense that you should try to push all of these decks. It's not like Crossover Breaker where you play Ryuge one game and you realize those cards, aside from the field spell, are very bad. So keep testing new decks and then let me know any cool findings or thoughts because I need to decide on a deck for the city tournament soon. And all I know right now is that I'm probably going to go with Malice or one of the new decks.